Okay, this is Vertigo Film Class. This is week 8, part 5. Um, the the real problem between Midge and Kim Novak, it's just that Kim Novak is so much more glamorous. Kim Novak is both glamorous and mysterious. That's what Midge is missing. Midge isn't glamorous because she doesn't have great taste in clothing, and she's not mysterious, partly because she's just a person Jimmy Stewart knows well. He's known her since college. They used to be engaged. Whether that means they had a sexual relationship while they were engaged, I do not know. But he knows her pretty well. And not that, like, they chit chat about women's underclothing. He sits in her studio and camp. He's very comfortable there, and he makes drinks in her house and hangs out and just relaxes there while she's doing work, and he's like in her apartment. Um, so she lacks the mystery. It's one of the things this movie is about, and David Lynch is very much about this too, which is this idea of both glamour and mystery is what makes Kim Novak really different from Midge. Um, okay, cool. So the all right, I mentioned earlier that Midge is trying to sort of puncture Jimmy Stewart's fantasies by making fun of the fact that he's so in love with a woman who's staring at a painting, and the woman in the painting looks like the woman who's looking at the painting. But I mentioned sort of how destructive it is that she tries to sort of destroy his fantasy in that way, in making fun of the fantasy, instead of what Grace Kelly does in Rear Window, which is become engaged and invested in the fantasy to try to join him in the fantasy. But there's something interesting here, which is that puncturing a fantasy is exactly what Jimmy Stewart is trying to do to Kim Novak. Um, Jimmy Stewart, because Kim Novak, Madeline, I should call her Madeline, but Madeline is obsessed with this idea that she's haunted by images of a grave, and that it's her own grave, and she's being pulled toward it, and that she may have, some kind of psychological. She stares at this painting, and she does her hair like in the painting, and she wears necklace like in the painting, and so the idea is that Madeline, Kim Novak, is haunted by a fantasy, and that Jimmy Stewart is trying to sort of talk her out of it like a psychologist would, to try to say, just like Midge tried to make fun of Jimmy Stewart slipping into fantasy, about being so in love with this mysterious, glamorous person as a kind of fantasy. He doesn't really know that much about her. Um, and that he's trying to puncture Madeline's fantasy, where she's haunted by the ghosts of sort of her, her relative great grandmother, and the fantasies of suicide, and this madness and whatever. When she loses time, doesn't know where she's going, doesn't know what she's doing. She's in the grip of some kind of fantasy, and he's going to kind of talk her out of it. Now, what happens next is one of the most shocking moments in film history. So I hope you've seen the movie already. Surely you've seen the movie already if you've gotten this far. Which is the death. Kim Novak. She has this vision of a place. He takes her. He says, "That's not a crazy fantasy. It's a real place. You've been here." And they go to this sort of mission, sort of religious thing, and she rushes into the church, and she climbs the tower, and he tries to chase after her, and his vertigo kicks in, so he can't get to the top. And then he sees her commit suicide and plummet to her death. It's a shocking moment. She's like, this is like the main character in the movie, and like that was really sudden. It was crazy. And then they have the inquest, which is sort of the sort of legal, with the jury and everything, to find out if anybody did anything wrong. Hilariously, when I played this movie in film class when I was in person, one of my students, during the scene where Jimmy Stewart's getting the lawyers kind of, deciding who did right and wrong, she was packing her bag, and I was like, what are you doing?" And she was like, "Well, the movie's just about over. We're gonna go home soon." And I was like, "Oh, no, 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 no! This movie hasn't even gotten started." But it feels like the end, doesn't it? It feels like such a big ending, that he loved this woman, and she died, and he fucked up. The end. That trial scene, by the way, is completely brutal, and it's brutal because it's about masculinity. It's about the ideas that so much of this movie has been about show up in that trial scene. And I took extra good notes for this part. But the guy investigating, the Jimmy Stewart, is sitting right there. And the sort of judge character, he's not really a judge, but whatever, he's in charge of investigating this thing, talks about how, like, his fear and his weakness made him powerless to save her. Um, in his past, he allowed a colleague to fall to his death. Speaking about the police officer in the opening of Vertigo, um, he didn't make enough of an effort. He had a lack of initiative. He did nothing. Um, and then he ran away after the woman committed suicide. Um, he once again allowed someone to die and ran away. It is a brutal scene. Because, of course, this is everything Jimmy Stewart already feels. At the very beginning of the movie, he felt less than masculine because he's wearing a corset to heal his injuries, and he's got his cane, and he can't climb tall buildings anymore, and he can't be a police officer anymore because maybe he'd have to run on a rooftop again, and he wouldn't be able to do it because of his vertigo. So he's to work at a desk with papers. It's stupid. So he feels like he's not manly. And boy, this inquest, this sort of legal thing, makes it like official. Like there are people that he's being judged. Notice, by the way, and again, this is very typical for a jury in 1958, they're all men, right? It's a jury of 12 men that are judging him for lack of manliness. He is weak. He is powerless. He allowed people to die. He didn't make enough effort. He didn't have initiative. He did nothing. He ran away. He ran away. They're like, this is being recorded for like the official record or whatever. So this is now like a permanent thing for him. And it is a hilariously brutal scene. Um, uh, and it's funny in a way too, because it's so over the top, and he already feels bad. But they're emphasizing how much worse it really is, and how terrible it is, and how he failed because of his weakness. You see the same thing in Rear Window, where Grace Kelly goes over to the other apartment, and he can't go over there with her to save her. He's powerless in his chair. This is something Hitchcock was interested in. This is the second Hitchcock movie. It's why it's always a good idea to watch more than one movie by the same director, particularly major movies by the same director, because then you can see what are the ideas they're interested in. Maybe you wouldn't notice that Rear Window is about masculinity, but when you watch this and when you watch Vertigo and Rear Window and The Birds and Psycho, you begin to see a pattern emerging, and it makes it easier to see these things. Sometimes students are surprised that I'm able to see this stuff, but like it's just because I watch a lot of movies. And once you start to see, you see enough of them by the same guy, and you start to go, wait a minute, I'm seeing a pattern here. Um, and he's haunted. He's haunted by this terrible experience, not just her suicide, but his own weakness. And there's a dream sequence where you see these colors and the Spanish music and these sort of cartoon flowers that burst apart. It's really neat, actually. I mean, a lot of students laugh at it, but I think it's kind of cool. But it's a really interesting little sequence. And you also see a floating, his head sort of floating with this crazy lights and stuff behind it. Please remember the floating head. That will come back in Lost Highway, which is the last movie of this unit. And boy, if Blue Velvet is a remake of Rear Window, Lost Highway, if Blue Velvet is a fucked up remake of Rear Window, then Lost Highway is a fucked up remake of Vertigo. It's amazing. But it's this wacky dream sequence with a kind of floating head thing, and it's really interesting. It's just visually engaging. It's just a really interesting dream sequence, and it's very colorful, and it's very unusual to have a cartoon in the middle of a live action movie. It's just a really neat choice, and it's really dynamic. And I'm allowed to say it's just cool. It's just a cool looking, unusual thing, and I like it. Notice, by the way, what this does to his relationship with Midge. Because the next scene, he's like recovering in a mental hospital from this terrible thing that happened to him. And by the way, it's terrible that the woman he loved committed suicide, but I really think his real problem is how his lack of masculinity was so exposed to all those men on the jury. Very similar to how in Blue Velvet, Kyle MacLachlan isn't upset that Frank beat the crap out of him. He's upset because he's turned into Frank. It's more of a psychological issue than it is a sort of real world issue. Okay, actually, I'll talk about Midge in the next video. Yeah.